Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to today's training. I can see some of you guys already found it. You should see that introduction poll when you log into the webinar. We want to know who's joining us today. Go ahead and select which of the following best describes the type of agency that you work for. Maybe you're from a resettlement agency, child welfare, a school, or other educational provider, law enforcement, anti-trafficking, health, mental health, legal, government, community-based organization. Go ahead and fill out that poll as we're just waiting a minute or so for people to join before we get started. If you're just joining us, welcome. Thank you for being here. Go ahead and fill out that poll that should have popped up on your screen as soon as you logged in. We just want to get an idea of who's joining us today. The poll is anonymous, but you can just go ahead and select which of the following best describes the type of agency you work for. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. I'll share the results so you can see it. It looks like we have about 50% resettlement agency staff. Welcome, everybody. We have some child welfare and educational staff, anti-trafficking, health, mental health, some government staff, community-based organizations, a legal provider, and some other organizations. So thank you so much for joining us today for today's webinar. My name is Sarah Najnawi. I'm the Director of Capacity Building and Outreach with our Children's Services team here at USCRI. And I'm joined today by Sean Dino, who's our Training and Resource Specialist with the Refugee Youth Resource Center at USCRI. And we also have Allison Mitchell from our training team. She'll kind of be behind the scenes with us today, supporting with some of those Zoom functions. So today's training is on engaging with refugee youth and fostering resilience in different stages of child and adolescent development. This is kind of a fun training because it's very positive and kind of solution focused, and hopefully you'll all kind of be walking away with some practical strategies and new ideas for identifying and building upon youth strengths and fostering resilience with refugee youth. So we wanted to provide kind of somewhat of an introduction. We are the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, or USCRI. We're a non-governmental, nonprofit organization, and we provide a variety of services for refugee families who are newly resettled in the United States. We also have a policy and advocacy team. We provide legal services in some of our field offices. We have an anti-trafficking program for both youth and adult survivors of human trafficking, international programs in Kenya and Central America, and children's services programs, which include unaccompanied children's services, as well as our Refugee Youth Resource Center. So the Refugee Youth Resource Center is a national training and technical assistance initiative that is part of USCRI's Children's Services. And this is a grant-funded program through ORR, which stands for the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Our focus is really on building provider capacity to foster resilience of refugee youth, their integration into life here in the US, and promote and ensure child safety. And so we'll be doing this in a variety of ways, one of which is through training, and that includes these monthly webinars that we just started last month and will kind of continue on. As well as targeted training for providers and organizations by request. Will also be available for case consultation for providers that might be dealing with kind of high needs or high risk complex cases involving a refugee youth. And we'll have a public facing resource website that is coming soon that will be kind of a central hub for all of these training and technical assistance activities for providers, as well as feature multilingual resources for refugee youth and families themselves. So again, that is coming soon, and we encourage you to stay tuned, and we'll keep you posted on kind of all of those different activities and the website rolling out. So wanted to review our learning objectives for today. We are hoping that you kind of walk away from this training being able to really recognize protective factors that strengthen resilience of refugee children and youth, that you'll be able to identify practical strategies to facilitate engagement with refugee children and youth at different stages of development. We'll be exploring activities from our Refugee Youth Resource Center toolkit to foster resilience of refugee youth. And then we'll be applying strengths-based, resilience-focused approaches to case examples with the idea that you can kind of, in turn, translate that to your work in the field with the actual youth and families that you're working with. So just a few housekeeping items before we kind of dive into the content. We do have the chat open today, and we encourage your participation throughout. And so again, we'll be using the chat for discussion and participation, and that Q&A box, which if you kind of navigate to your Zoom toolbar, you should see the Q&A icon, or you can click on the 3 dots labeled More and select Q&A. And that's where we'll ask you to insert your questions kind of throughout the training today in the Q&A, and we'll save some time at the end to respond to those. Again, Q&A is better for questions so that they don't get lost in the chat with all of the discussion that we plan to have during today's training. And I believe Allison already put this in the chat, but the materials for today's webinar, so these slides, the toolkit that we'll be reviewing, and the training recording will be available at refugees.org. And we'll provide that link a couple different times throughout the training in case you lose it in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Sean to get us started talking about a strengths-based approach.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Again, thank you all for joining today's webinar. We're so glad to see so many of you from a diverse background in terms of the type of work that you're doing, but also from various parts of the country. So as we jump into talking about a strengths-based approach, we really want to start by defining our terms. You have maybe heard of these terms before, but we want to kind of build a framework by starting to talk about what we mean by these terms and then kind of go from there. So the first is, what is a strengths perspective? This is an approach that focuses on the youth's qualities, resources, and capabilities rather than their deficits and pathology. So really, it is a choice that we're making to value resettled youth for who they are rather than minimizing them by any sort of label that they might be coming to us with as refugee or otherwise. We want to check our biases and remember to see them coming with lots of qualities, skills, and giftings that we can encourage in them. So an example of this would be, rather than getting frustrated at newcomer youth for being limited in their English speaking skills, we want to choose to see the positive aspects of them being bilingual, trilingual, or multilingual. The next is resilience. What we mean by resilience is the ability to effectively cope with and recover from stressful and traumatic events. Resilience is often talked about as a rubber band. So just as a rubber band goes through lots of stress and straining and bounces back to its original state, we want to use that as an idea to kind of talk about resilience and the ability for children and adolescents who are being resettled in the States to come out stronger from their experiences that might be stressful. We also want to talk about the fact that they have the capacity to overcome and be transformed by these experiences and rebuild their lives and move forward. That is what we mean by resilience. And lastly, what are protective factors? These are factors in a young person's life, surroundings, personality, environment, social relationships, culture, and setting that can help foster resilience. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in the coming slides. But before we do, we want to pose a question to you all. And that question is, what are some examples of strengths and protective factors that you have identified when working with refugee youth and children? So please take a moment to think about the question and write your answers in the chat. Adaptability, yeah, good one. Determination, courage, strong family units, family, Willingness to learn. Wow, that's a good one. Openness, faith. Yeah, we'll be talking about that too. Bilingualism. Yeah. Um, Community support. So these are all great answers. God counsel. Uh, yeah. Um, that Let's go to the next slide, and you can continue to write your examples into the chat. But really, what we can start by doing is breaking down these factors into a few different categories. We have 7 that we really want to highlight, and many of those that you've talked about could fit into these categories. But the first is family and social support. In our last webinar last month, we discussed the impact of helping parents and caregivers to feel supported and resourced so that they can better care for their children. And this is a really huge aspect when it comes to a protective factor. If the family home and unit is a place of safety and trust for young people, they're going to have a lot more resilience and have and parents will have a lot more capacity to support their children if they feel like they have support in the greater community. And the next point here is that we can encourage resilience through strengthening bonds across generations. So this can be between family members, whether it be grandparents and grandkids, parents and children. It can also be between adults of friends or other safe adults in their schools or other places. These can be helpful for children to rely on or to know people that they can trust as they cope with challenging situations. The next point here too is family reunification is vital to building emotional resilience for kids. If they know that their family can come to them and be reunified to them rather than just being lost around the world or in other places, that can really build resilience. And then lastly, we want to focus on the positive aspects of peer relationships, of mentors, of faith leaders, and neighbors. Um, the next protective category that we want to talk about is personal characteristics. This includes things like self-efficacy, emotional regulation, optimism, adaptability, as was already said in the chat, and resourcefulness. Um, these are all characteristics that a young person that can possess or learn to build in themselves, have greater self-awareness, self-worth, and self-esteem. The next factor would be education and supportive school environments. Much research has been done about this, but for young people to feel accepted, feel that they can see themselves as being capable and can find community in schools will help them to be more open to learning, to more quickly adapt to picking up language, and really have a desire to learn because the school environment is a place of safety. Um, the next category would be legal relief. Whether or not a young person or their family has permanent legal status ultimately impacts how safe a young person can feel in their new home and how rooted they desire to become. If they only know that they're going to be here for a temporary period, there may not be as open to building relationships and having more support around them because of a fear of safety and other things. An example of this is the American and European response to Ukrainian refugees, how the swiftness and decisive action that the governments took to provide temporary protective support for refugees coming from Ukraine has decreased the compounding impact of trauma on refugee youth and their families. Next would be setting goals and helping young people to think about the future and set long-term and short-term goals will foster a sense of meaning and purpose for the young person. And that ultimately will build resilience. Next would be spirituality. This can mean staying connected to religious communities or exploring different spiritual practices that they may be used to or may desire to learn about. This can provide moral support, guidance, and meaning to understand the difficulties that they faced in life. And evidence shows that newcomer communities that maintain religious and spiritual practices exhibit more resilience than those who do not. The last category is cultural resilience and identity. And we want to spend a little bit more time focusing on this and highlighting some aspects about this. So um, uh, as we talk about cultural identity as it relates to resilience, culture and identity can really be a source of strength and pride for refugee youth. This can come about as they build a sense of belonging and community. It can be a struggle for refugee youth because they're coming in trying to navigate both cultures, both the home culture or the heritage culture and US culture. Um, but in kind of balancing the two and learning from both, they can learn flexibility, as was the first resilience factor that somebody mentioned, strength. They can have insight about other cultures and exposure to new ideas and ways of living. The next point here, as was shared in the chat, is multilingualism and a cross-cultural perspective. I really see this as a superpower that the newcomer youth possess. When we talk about multilingualism, we're talking about knowing about or learning to speak more than one language. Refugee youth have been shown to be able to distinguish nuances between languages, not just speak the words of the language, but to be able to pick up on those cues. And the other thing is cross-cultural perspective. These are young people who have had exposure to two or more cultures or countries in the developmental years of their life. And this is something that we want to highlight, that growing up in these different settings and having exposure to different viewpoints can help them to think outside the box much more quickly than other youth who have more of a black and white thinking. They can more easily accept the views of people who are different from themselves. And then studies show that newcomers who have the ability to be multicultural and multilingual, they have much more academic success than others who are not. Um, Another point here, just to kind of bring home the idea of family again, is that for many cultures from which refugee youth come from, they have defined roles for particular family members, and they exhibit high respect for elders. So as refugee youth become introduced to American cultural concepts of independence, autonomy, freedom, individual rights, involving parents and grandparents, other family members into decisions and planning can honor their role in the family and demonstrate respect for their culture. Along the same lines, many of these cultures take a holistic approach to decision making that prioritizes the group over the individual. So we want to highlight concern that young people express for others as a strength, and that in and of itself will help them to see the community around them and value that. Um, we also, as was talked about as a protective factor, is religion. But religion and culture can often be very much tied together. Thinking about Islam, the identity as a Muslim for somebody can be something is not just a cultural or not just a religious practice, but it's whole culture around how to do life. And so encouraging young people to explore spirituality on their own terms and in their own way and their own timing really honors their cultural preferences and builds that self-autonomy. So the final note here that we want to remember that not all cultures are homogenous, and values within a country or culture can shift based on region, religion, social class, language, and family. So with that, we're going to jump into engaging children and youth in different stages of development. So I'll hand it back over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Sean. And to kind of kick off this section, we're going to ask you again to kind of share from your experience. We're going to kind of be talking about engagement strategies with refugee children and youth. So we want to know from you, kind of hear from you, what are some of the challenges or barriers that you've experienced when building rapport and engaging with refugee children and youth? And also, thinking about how do age and developmental stage come into play with some of those barriers or challenges that you faced. All right, my top four are language barrier. That's a big one, right? Trust, cultural differences, gender norms. Tough to make connections through an interpreter. That's a great one. Distractions and disinterest. Okay. Age difference, more introverted children, lack of transportation, self-esteem, fear, for sure, trauma, filtering by adults, lack of trust, maybe special needs, housing issues, some of those basic needs not being met. Humor doesn't always translate. Yes, Patrice, that's so true. Pressure from parents. Many children are not used to having adults asking them about themselves, their likes, dislikes. Yeah, it might actually put them on the defense a little bit if they have an adult asking all sorts of questions about themselves, for sure. Legal access. Some families discourage open emotional expression or seeking outside support. Yeah, that can make a youth more hesitant or cautious about opening up to us or even participating in services. Younger ages and developmental levels may be more comfortable communicating and engaging with their older siblings more than our adult staff. Okay, yeah, having kind of a safe person there that they feel a little more comfortable with can be a big help in situations like that. Parents' education, fear of parents' reactions. Great. These are great responses. So we're going to kind of touch on some of these, and hopefully some of the strategies and tips that we provide in this training can kind of overcome some of those challenges and barriers. One of the things that I wanted to highlight is part of this training is we'll be kind of going over a lot of strategies for you all as providers, as well as handouts and resources to help you kind of support refugee youth, engage, build rapport, and kind of foster that resilience. And so Allison will go ahead and share this link in the chat again, but on refugees.org, this is where, for the time being, we're housing our training materials for the Refugee Youth Resource Center. And if you scroll down to this month's training on engaging with refugee youth, you'll see our webinar slides here, but you'll also have access to this toolkit for providers. And so again, we have kind of put this together with you. You have a table of contents here, but different tip sheets on considerations for engaging with refugee children and youth. We have a tip sheet for engaging with younger children as well as adolescents. We also have several handouts that you can actually print out and use, many of which are kind of preceded by a little guide for you all as providers in terms of kind of questions to consider or prompts for you to ask the youth to help them kind of engage in the activity. So you can see several of those here. And again, we're going to be going over several of these worksheets and kind of tips and strategies throughout the training today. I also wanted to highlight, because some of the handouts actually come from our Ready for Life curriculum, which is a social emotional learning curriculum for refugee youth. They're already available in multiple languages. So I also wanted to share that on refugees.org, you do have some of the selected toolkit handouts available in these languages. So if I click Spanish, for example, you'll see that I have these printable handouts available in different languages. And that's true of these other languages that you see here on your screen. So those are free for you to use right away. You can start using them today when you go visit a family if you think that it would be beneficial for a youth or a family that you're working with. So we'll dive in first to some of those kind of considerations for engagement with refugee youth. This was the number one response that many of you answered when I first asked that question about challenges and barriers, which is language and communication, right? Refugee youth, of course, might have limited English proficiency and interrupted schooling because of their history of forced displacement. And so one thing that we can be really careful about and intentional about is using really kind of clear, simple language, avoiding idioms or slang that the youth might not understand or might not be easily translatable into their native language. Someone said that humor doesn't easily translate, right? And so those are just kind of things to keep in mind and important to use kind of that clear, simple language. When we talk about working with interpreters, we want to make sure that we're using qualified interpreters, and that means avoiding using children themselves or their siblings as interpreters. Someone mentioned this, but also understanding that using an interpreter can actually make it more challenging to establish rapport and trust, because sometimes children establish more of a relationship with the interpreter themselves because that's the person that they're directly communicating with in their native language. And so all that to say is that as providers, we just need to kind of acknowledge these barriers and kind of allow time and space for children to develop that trust and confidence in communicating with us. Sean also went over some of those kind of cultural considerations, right? Of course, we know that refugee youth may have different cultural norms around communication, social behavior, how they express their emotions, and then some of those different values that Sean mentioned related to family roles, respect for authority, education, the individual versus the group collective, right? And so we want to kind of have this in mind and also be aware of how our own cultural assumptions and biases might shape our interpretation of a youth's responses and behaviors. So kind of checking ourselves and not assuming that we know necessarily a youth's culture, approaching those situations with cultural humility and curiosity, and taking steps to really learn about the youth's culture from those who are familiar with it, and that of course includes the youth themselves. Family and social dynamics are also an important consideration to kind of have in mind as we're engaging with refugee youth. So family roles often do really shift during the resettlement process, with youth kind of frequently taking on more adult responsibilities. They might end up serving as an interpreter for their parents or kind of systems navigators. And that's because refugee youth do tend to acculturate faster than their parents. They tend to acquire English more quickly. But this can often result in kind of conflicts and tension at home related to the new culture, right? Youth might feel kind of torn or stuck between their home culture, which is the culture of their parents, and their new culture, which is the US culture and the culture of their peers. And so one of the things that we can really try to do as providers is kind of bridge that gap, right? Like help kids and their parents and caregivers bridge that gap, and we can kind of partner with youth and their parents and caregivers to have, kind of foster positive conversations and communication to help them kind of set expectations together regarding school or household responsibilities or what is acceptable behavior at home and outside of the home, etc. And you'll see this as kind of a theme throughout today's training, but youth who have a say in that conversation and that kind of setting of expectations and rules are going to be more willing to follow through, right? Because they've been able to kind of express their needs and opinions, and their voice has been heard and kind of incorporated into that final decision. And then finally, we want to, of course, be kind of considering and remembering and recognizing kind of the underlying trauma that our refugee youth are bringing with them. In last month's training, we talked about that triple trauma paradigm, and that kind of refers to the trauma that refugee youth may experience during the different stages of resettlement. So, of course, pre-flight in their home country, right? Being exposed to or experiencing war, violence, conflict, persecution that results in that forced displacement to begin with. but also the trauma they might experience en route to the United States during their journey, and that includes in refugee camps where many youth, live for many years before they're finally resettled. It also includes kind of trauma that children may experience even after resettlement or post-flight, right? Like isolation, separation from family members, that transitional shock. And so something that we want to just remember as providers is to kind of the importance of recognizing the impact of that kind of compounded trauma on kids' adjustment, on their development, on their sense of safety, and on their kind of physical and mental health. And so, we can really kind of intentionally practice trauma-informed approaches to working with kids. One of the things that is important to understand is that mistrust and fear may be very common. Some of you all mentioned fear and lack of trust as one of the common barriers and challenges. And this is extremely common. It's not something to take personally. It's actually very natural that a refugee youth who has experienced significant trauma in possibly many different ways, for them to be really wary of adults and people that they see as figures of authority. And that includes providers such as us, right? And so it's really on us and part of our job as providers to create safe spaces and to earn youth's trust. And again, we can kind of use trauma-informed approaches to do that by prioritizing safety, the youth's voice and choice in services, and kind of empowering them to make decisions that impact them. Privacy and confidentiality are also really critical to gaining and keeping a child's trust, right? So that means being open and transparent with youth about your role and any sharing of information, and also providing support without forcing the youth to share past experiences that could be re-traumatizing to them. So unless you're here as a mental health therapist and that's your role working with refugee youth, then probably for the rest of us, interviewing a refugee youth or delving into the details about their trauma history, it would really be outside of our scope, and it could actually be more harmful to a youth because it could be re-traumatizing for them. So as we talk about kind of engagement strategies, I want us to keep in mind the stages of development that we covered in last month's training. We'll be kind of talking about strategies for working with children in these different stages. So the first being infancy and early childhood, that preschool 0 to 5. Middle childhood 6 to 11 being that elementary age, and then early and late adolescence, kind of middle, high school into early adulthood, that 12 to 24 range. So let's take a look first at kind of refugee children and development in early childhood, that 0 to 5. So of course, kind of preschool age children, they're starting to develop language, but an important thing to remember is they're really unable to express their thoughts and fears in words like other children. Older toddlers start to be able to follow simple instructions. We see increased kind of socialization. They're learning through play. They start to assert their independence. And this is also a really important stage where the child is kind of creating a bond and sense of security with a primary caregiver. And just something to keep in mind when you're working with refugee children, the impact of any sort of disrupted early attachment or bonding with that primary caregiver, maybe because of displacement or resettlement or family separation or the death of a primary caregiver, that can have really lasting impacts on a child's kind of sense of safety, security, trust, and kind of how they approach relationships even later in life. So those are kind of things to consider at this stage. And thinking about some of these characteristics, curious to hear from you all, what are some strategies that you use or would use for engaging with a refugee child in this very early stage of development? Play? Oh, I love that. Yes. What else? Any specific examples of that? Okay, games, art therapy, getting on their level, eye contact, lots of imitation, coloring time with conversation, songs, visuals, modeling. Incorporating the parent, thanks for that. Puppets, I like that. Homework helping, coloring with music, stickers, being silly, yes. Comfort food, a meal with the child's family, worksheets with images, redirecting when the child's distracted, listening more and talking yes, or talking less. Thank you for that. Positive reinforcement with smiles, clapping. Great. Thank you guys so much. We're going to kind of look at middle childhood. So that's kind of moving into the elementary age, 6 to 11. And then we'll kind of look at strategies for kind of both of these groups combined. So thinking about development in middle childhood, keeping in mind that for refugee children, displacement really disrupts that process of learning and socialization. So kind of under normal circumstances, a child in middle childhood is really rapidly developing mental skills like reading and math. They're starting to describe experiences, talking about their thoughts and feelings, right? They can kind of empathize. They're forming more complex friendships, understanding the perspectives of others. They're starting to kind of achieve a sense of satisfaction from their skills and abilities. And it's also a stage where they tend to seek approval from adults, not just their parents, but adults like you all. And they might be especially sensitive to criticism at this age. So curious to hear from you, given these characteristics, any other strategies, any additional strategies besides those mentioned that you use or would use for building rapport and engaging with a child who's at elementary school age? Active listening, rephrasing their statements, taking an interest, learning their likes, taking an interest in their interests, yes. Respecting their intelligence and thoughts, being curious, just listening, helping with reading, understanding their culture, respecting personal space, avoid expressing frustration or shaming, yeah. High fives, yes. Asking about school, friends, activities, playing sports while talking, praising, even for small accomplishments, engaging in parallel play, smile and looking at them while talking to them, acknowledging their mannerisms, asking for their opinion. These are wonderful. Thank you guys. So we're going to share some additional engagement strategies for work with younger children. Some of you guys covered some of these, so that's really great that you're already doing this. At least one or two people mentioned this. The first being super simple, right? Just getting on the child's level. So even physically positioning yourself at the child's height by stooping down or kneeling or sitting on the floor with them can improve that connection and communication. It helps make young children feel safer and more engaged. A lot of you had some really great ideas for engaging young children in play as kind of a way to kind of break the ice and make children feel really comfortable in talking with you. So many of you might already do this, but even having some small toys like cars or animal figurines or action figures in your work bag that you can kind of bring out whenever you're working with a young child, again, just to kind of create a setting that doesn't feel so kind of formal and serious for a refugee child. Similarly, a drawing pad and markers or crayons is a very easy thing just to kind of have in your bag at all times. It makes for a very kind of simple activity. You could have the child draw themselves and ask about their drawing. The squiggle game is a fun one where you kind of tell the child to draw a big old squiggle any way they want on a blank piece of paper and then kind of ask, what do you see? What does it look like? And have them kind of draw a picture from their squiggle. And it's just, again, kind of a fun game that can hopefully help break the ice and make the child feel more comfortable talking to you and engaging with you and maybe opening up about some things. We talked about using really simple language. This is especially true for young children, right? Making sure that we're incorporating the child's own terms and how they're describing their experience. Someone said kind of rephrasing or reflecting back, making sure that we're, saying in a different way any questions that the child doesn't understand. I think this probably goes for anyone, but avoiding that rapid fire kind of question after question kind of interview style and just allowing time for the youth to respond, asking the child to elaborate, or simply acknowledging their response, right? Even just some kind of silence between you and the child while you're drawing or coloring together can really go a long way in making that child feel kind of comfortable. And some of you mentioned this one as well. With this age, we also really want to consider that attachment, right? And that some people still might not feel comfortable participating or talking with you without their parent or caregiver present, and that's okay, right? Especially when you're just starting a relationship with a young child, you're still a stranger to them. And so part of kind of that development of a secure attachment is feeling comfortable kind of uh, branching out from that secure base of the parent or caregiver who's their primary source of trust and support, and feeling comfortable with new adults. And the reality is that a lot of kids might not be there yet, and especially refugee children who have been through trauma and potentially disrupted attachment. So again, creating safety and involving that parent or caregiver kind of as you see fit. So these are kind of a couple fun activities that incorporate that aspect of play with older preschool age kids or elementary school age kids. So 3 wishes. If you had 3 wishes about your future, what would they be? Or the magic wand. If you had a magic wand, what would you change about your family, your school, where you live, yourself, right? And kind of on the surface, they feel kind of, fun, playful activities and conversation starters, but they also kind of serve a purpose, right? In this 3 wishes, it's kind of a way for us to assess and explore the child's goals for the future. Um, in this magic wand activity, it kind of provides an opening for us to assess a little bit more how things are going at home, at school, within their family, how that child feels about themselves and what they might want to change, right? But again, kind of adding that aspect of play will make the child kind of feel more comfortable and opening up. So these are included in our toolkit as well, but are kind of fun ideas for starting some of that assessment and engagement with a young child. So moving into refugee youth and kind of that adolescent stage, which is a very broad range, that 12 to 24, we see refugee youth really prioritizing peer relationships and seeking social acceptance, respect, and independence. They're starting to really form their identity and develop their own set of values and beliefs. And just keep in mind with refugee youth that resettlement is made even more complex by those simultaneous changes of puberty, right? All of those physical and hormonal changes that are going on. Their developing sense of self, their peer relationships and sense of identity within their group of peers, and that kind of shifting of the parent-child relationship that we talked about a little bit earlier in the training, right? All of those things kind of going on at once. So thinking about this developmental stage, I'd love to hear some more ideas. You guys have had some great ideas so far and strategies so far. What are some of the ones that you use for building rapport and engaging with adolescents, refugee adolescents? Group work. Okay, yes, learning from each other and creating social support. Playing sports, being open to what they say, trust. Assigning a buddy. Kids you worked with last year with brand new kids. Coloring pages, summarizing the conversation to ensure understanding, sitting beside them rather than across them to ask questions, because sometimes eye contact can be intimidating or cause a shutdown. Asking about their interests, involving them in recreation, asking for their opinions, making jokes. Helps kids open up for sure. Activities just for fun, spending time together, being encouraging, non-judgmental. Establishing a balance regarding confidentiality with parents. Absolutely. That's part of the kind of trust and transparency of trauma-informed care, right? Card games, providing a listening space, goal setting. We'll talk about goal setting, crafts, being open-minded about their opinions, letting them Letting them make mistakes. Yes, that's part of learning and growing up, right? Listening without judging. All right, these are great. So we're going to go over some other kind of strategies with older youth. And some of you guys hit the nail on the head with this one, which is kind of first and foremost, really setting that tone of partnership from the start and taking a non-judgmental approach, really kind of seeking to understand the youth's perspective rather than coming into that interaction or relationship as the adult who knows what's best for that youth, right? We can also really work to kind of keep conversations positive and future focused. So not dwelling on past mistakes or past trauma, but rather kind of solution focused and looking towards the future. Getting to know the youth, several of you guys said this one, getting to know their likes and dislikes, engaging them in activities, just like with the younger children that foster the relationship while also maintaining healthy boundaries, right? That's something we always want to keep in mind. But drawing, playing cards while you're kind of having a conversation with the youth, going for a walk, listening to music, talking about sports or pop culture, right? Trying to find any kind of source of commonality and connection can really go a long way when it comes to engaging and building rapport with refugee youth. So part of a kind of strengths-based trauma-informed approach is also treating young people as the experts of their own lives with the ability to make their own decisions, right? Someone said, let them make mistakes, right? Because that's kind of how they learn and grow and adapt. And so one thing we can think about as providers is how can we kind of support youth's independence and autonomy? So for example, saying something like, I know you're not asking me for advice and it's your choice, but would you have my thoughts about that? Or now that you're here in the US, what are your goals for the future? What matters most to you right now, right? And it really kind of takes a step away again from kind of stepping in as the adult and saying, I know what's best. This is what we need to do. I think as helping professionals, so many of us have that kind of impulse or instinct sometimes to just jump in to fix it and find a solution. But in reality, part of a strengths-based approach is empowering youth to find their own solutions. And so again, kind of treating them as experts in their own lives, involving them in decision making and supporting autonomy are ways that we can do that and in turn kind of help build and foster resilience. Someone mentioned reflections and affirmations, so that's a really important engagement strategy, especially when we're working with older youth. So let's say in this example, you know, the youth shared something with us about difficulty adjusting in school or at home. We could say something like, thanks for sharing that with me. You went through a lot to come to the US, and it sounds like life here is not what you expected. Or that was a really difficult situation that you faced with your friend, but it sounds like you handled it really well, right? Kind of that validation goes a long way, kind of just listening to understand as opposed to listening to step in as the adult and tell them what they should or shouldn't have done in that situation. So those reflections and affirmations and validations can be a really powerful tool in just kind of respecting the youth as a person and supporting their autonomy and resilience. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of exploring goals with older youth. Really at the core of youth empowerment is this belief and idea that young people, and that absolutely includes refugee youth who are newly arrived in the US, that they're capable of very great things, right? An empowered young person recognizes their capabilities and self-worth. And so one of the things that we can really think about is what can we do as providers to kind of provide tools and opportunities to help refugee youth build their confidence in their abilities. And that might mean kind of taking a step back from our to-do list. Many of us have kind of our must-do items that are kind of requirements of our program. These are things you need to, you know, kind of accomplish with every family or achieve with every student, right? But kind of taking a step away from that kind of standard to-do list with families, thinking about the youth as a unique individual with their own passions, their own goals, their own dreams for the future. That's really part of youth empowerment. And so, we can really include youth in the goal setting process. This helps make sure that they're invested. It makes them more likely to follow through. We can be consistent, right? If we work with a youth to set a goal, that we're following up with them about their progress, it shows that we're invested too, that we care. It helps kind of hold them accountable, and maybe we can kind of troubleshoot solutions to barriers if they're running into a challenge, achieving that goal. And if a youth struggles with goal setting, helping them warm up to it and relating the goal to their strengths. So some of the worksheets in the toolkit that I showed you, the guide kind of encourages providers, like if a youth can't think of anything, like you point out some of the strengths that you've seen in them, even during your short time working together. In this example, we have the case manager kind of talking to this refugee youth, and she says, let's start with something small. How about we pick a goal for this week that feels doable, right? Especially for refugee youth, it's really kind of normal and natural that they might have trouble thinking about goals in the long term because they've been in survival mode for so long. And that's just something that can really help. We can kind of help break those goals down into kind of shorter baby steps until the youth is, feeling more confident and comfortable about thinking further ahead. So these are a few different prompts that you could consider using when exploring goals with refugee youth. And again, we've kind of broken this up into kind of the younger children versus the adolescents, but depending on kind of, your relationship with the youth and their kind of social and emotional maturity, like some of our elementary school kids could actually absolutely kind of engage with some of these prompts as well. So that's just something to keep in mind as we go through some of these. But a prompt like, imagine or draw yourself 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Write down a top 10 list of things you want to try or do, right? Ways to kind of open up, like, what are things that I want for my future? What are goals that I could set and work on now to make it there? Writing a personal mission statement. My greatest passion is, I've always wanted to, my greatest abilities are, or what does the world need that could be met by my passion and abilities? A couple of the handouts in the toolkits and in the toolkit, and again, these are available in those multiple languages. One is a setting and an achieving goals worksheet that has, helps the youth identify a goal, the underlying value and priority, and kind of like what's next, what are the next steps, what are the strengths and supports they already kind of have in place to help them get there. And the tree of strengths is kind of a different approach to goal setting, where the youth first kind of identifies their strengths and then kind of goals and interests tied to those strengths and the support network to help them there. So again, these are available in the toolkit and really help and can be really helpful to kind of initiate that goal setting conversation with older youth. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Sean, who's going to be talking a little bit more about fostering resilience with refugee youth.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So as we jump into the next section, I just wanted to get a reading of the room and see how many of you, whether you're homeowners or just love gardening, have ever transplanted a tree or a shrub in their yard or in a garden before. It'd be great to just see how many of you might have experience in this area. It will be relatable in just a second, but yes, shrubs, not shrubs, but different plants. Yeah, so the good number of you have. The reason why I asked this question is because just like a transplanted tree or a shrub might go through some initial shock, it can learn to grow and thrive and bear much fruit if it is put in the right condition, if it is transplanted in the right place, if that place has the right soil, light, and water. In the same way, refugee youth have gone through traumatic experiences and faced shock, but with the right support systems and placed in the right environment, they have the ability to come out stronger and to thrive in their new surroundings. So we want to kind of, in the same way the transplanted trees need that soil, light, and water, we want to focus on three main areas that keep youth at the center of this journey towards resilience. So the first aspect is the first thing that we want to focus on is adjusting our own perspectives. We all come with biases. We all have cultural narratives and social assumptions that we bring to this work. But we want to keep that trauma-informed practice and strengths-based approach, and remember to kind of check those things at the door that might get in the way of us actually keeping youth at the center of this journey towards resilience. The next thing is supporting their autonomy and their self-agency. And by agency, what we really mean is the young person's ability to make their own choices and to act for themselves. We want them to be active participants, not just passive observers and recipients of service from us. So we want to involve youth in the decision-making process that affect them and their futures. We want to support the development of self-efficacy and self-worth. And ultimately, this will lead to improved resilience. And the last factor here is exploring tools and resources with the young people, with resettled youth, so that they can recognize and strengthen coping strategies they might already possess, the support systems that are around them to help them, and then other resources that they can get connected to that can foster that resilience. Another analogy, if you're not so much a gardener, but maybe more of a builder, is the idea of building a house. Just as each house needs to start with a foundation, we want to make sure that as we're working with youth, that they have their basic needs met. This is food, clothing, a sense of security, shelter. Like a foundation, these basic needs, if they're not met, will lead to refugee youth feeling unsafe. And that ultimately will impact their ability to make sense of what has happened to them and what they're feeling internally. Because if they're in that survival mode, the survival brain is the only thing that's online. And so we want to help them progress to the next stage. And we do that by thinking about that house analogy, focusing on the framing, building more support. So this is really building safety through connection. Young people can identify people who accept them fully, provide respect and support to them in this stage. But even if those basic needs are met, they need to feel safety, to feel protected, less vulnerable and less fearful. And so we can provide that through kind of reinforcing those support systems in their life. Third is to focus on the exterior work. So helping resettled youth build a sense of belonging. So at this stage, we do that by helping them make meaning of their lives and their stories of reality. In this stage, the amygdala, or the feeling brain, is back online, and the thinking brain is back online to help them, make sense of what has happened to them, and to also begin to identify feelings that are going on inside of them. The next stage is work on the internal work, cultivating self-worth. So at this stage, youth can identify their skills, abilities, strengths, and build self-worth from these. And then lastly, we want them to occupy the house. We want them to self-actualize and utilize the tools and resources that they have. And so in this stage, youth can process and overcome pain through connection, creativity, and humor. So before we jump into the last sort of resource that we'll provide to you, wanted just to get y'all's input and see what sort of strategies have you used that are creative and that help refugee children and youth explore their strengths, resources, and abilities. I see some of you uh, um, have to run, but for the rest of you, please feel free to try and answer this. Um, yeah, to tell them some strengths and skills, vision boarding, mentoring groups, uh, a strong group curriculum, art. As an artist, I love this one. Collage making, pottery, and other support groups. Yeah, these are all great. And you can continue to put them in here. But the last resource we want to provide you is also from the toolkit that Sarah shared earlier. You saw some of the pages, and I'll reference those in just a second. But it's a strengths-based approach called I Have, I Am, I Can. And this comes out of the International Resilience Project. And it supports resilience by helping youth, refugee youth particularly, recognize the resources, qualities, and capabilities they already possess. So all three areas are essential for refugee youth to build resilience. And so by helping them explore these three areas, you as a provider can build confidence. You can help them better understand themselves and help them feel more empowered to face the challenges that they have in the future and to pursue goals. So with the I have section here, our goal is really to focus on the connections and resources that are already around them. The I have refers to uh, family, mentors, friends, community programs, places that make them feel safe. In everyday interactions, adults and like yourself can help them identify trusted and supportive relationships, places of safety and protection, help them to identify people who encourage them and value their autonomy, role models that they can look up to and aspire to be like, um, that they can have and rely on healthy, predictable routines, rules, boundaries. Um, they have access to services like education, health, child welfare, safety. Really, the goal is to help them to recognize supportive connections that are in their life to help them feel anchored and valued and reinforce their own ability to navigate these challenges through these resources. Um, we're going to jump to the next slide, which Sarah mentioned these or just showed these quickly, but one is a worksheet and one is an activity around I have. The worksheet really has the young person asking the question, who and what helps me feel safe, supported, and valued? Examples that they could write down could be things like, I have my uncle who listens to me when I feel sad. I have my soccer team where I feel like a sense of belonging, and other things like that. They'll have the opportunity to list those out. And the activity is an opportunity for them to draw or to label themselves, but also to blanket around them different places of support, people who provide support, and things that provide support. The next area in this activity is to focus on the I am. Resilience is not just about what a young person has or what they can do, but how they see themselves. And so the I am focuses on the youth strengths, the positive qualities that they have that shape who they are. This could be things like kindness, curiosity, creativity, determination. So in everyday interactions, adults like yourself can help the young refugee youth build respect for themselves and perceive themselves as people who are liked and appreciated by others, have empathy towards and concern for others. They have respect for themselves and for other people. They are proud of themselves and their accomplishments that they have. Obviously, not in a overly boastful way, but who are building that confidence in who they are. Um, Responsibility for their own decisions and the actions that they take, and that they can be filled with hope, faith, and trust. So we're really acknowledging the skills, attributes, and personal qualities that they have to build that self-worth and self-agency. In the toolkit, you'll find the worksheet for the I am, which is really answering the question, what are some good things about yourself? What makes you feel special? So these are things like I'm brave, I'm a good friend, I'm proud of my culture. Um, so they have the opportunity to write those out. And then the activity is really where have the opportunity to write out on small pieces of paper or slips of paper or sticky notes, little affirmations. I am a good person. I'm a great friend. Um, I'm loved. Um, and when they have a tough day, they can go to the wall and pull that down, or go into the jar and pull out one of these slips that just builds their self-confidence and their self-worth, and can really feel supported. Um, so the last area here that we're trying to highlight is the I can. And this really is talking about what are the resources that a young person can use to navigate challenges. These are the support systems. This is setting goals. This is managing emotions. Um, we want them to foster that growth mindset, and to look to optimism and resourcefulness to navigate the challenges that they have. So in everyday interactions, adults like you can help the young person think of the people, uh, think of themselves as people who can talk about their feelings and concerns, solve problems and generate new ideas, manage feelings and impulses, ask for help when needed, find humor in life and use humor to reduce tension and accomplish goals and future plans. So in the in the toolkit, you'll see a worksheet that doesn't just have them, listing out the things that they can do, but specifically identifying scenarios that they face or might face difficult things in their life, and then thinking about what they can do when they face that. So when I'm having trouble in school, I can ask my teacher for help, is just an example. And then the last activity here is for them to take the feelings that they have, and think about a negative emotion that they might be feeling lately, and think about the ways that they can address that, or things that they can turn to in the midst of that situation to help themselves feel better. So with that, we're going to jump into a few case examples about refugee youth and their resilience. So I'll hand this over to Sarah again.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, so for this section, we're going to try to apply some of those strength-based and resilience-focused approaches to these case examples. Again, kind of with the idea that you can kind of then take that and apply to your work with refugee youth and families that you're working with. So our first example is Jean Reynald. He's a 17-year-old who arrived in the United States with his mother after fleeing gang violence and insecurity in Haiti. Since arriving, his mother has fallen ill, and Jean Reynald has started working in a restaurant kitchen to cover their needs and send financial support back home to their family members. Despite being unable to enroll in school full-time due to financial responsibilities, Jean Reynald started an adult ESL program and joined the band at his local church, where he quickly became a trusted peer and source of encouragement for other recently arrived Haitian youth. So I'm going to go ahead and have Allison put our first discussion question in the chat, which is, what strengths and forms of resilience stand out to you here in Jean Reynald's story? What are you seeing as some sources of strength for him? Work ethic, overcoming obstacles, taking on responsibility, kind of taking on that leadership role, trusting himself, optimism, being part of the church community, making decisions, helping others, hardworking, perseverance, the community within his church, taking ESL, a social network via his religious org, resilience, strong family ties, his ability to give back, his involvement in the community using his own experience, confidence in taking charge, taking responsibility. Absolutely, right? These are all really important strengths to highlight. Even that kind of peer mentorship and kind of informal leadership among other recently arrived Haitian youth. Kind of again, the financial contribution that he's making and responsibility to help support his family, being really kind of resourceful and finding a job to begin with and taking that initiative. And I think about too kind of the music, not just as a form of kind of recreation for him, but also a form of healthy coping and maintaining that social connection, like some of you said. So Alice, I'm going to have you put that second question in the chat for Jean Reynald. The question is, as a provider, how could you build upon Jean Reynald's strengths and existing support systems to help connect him with other resources and supports? Any ideas? Connecting with other youth involved in music, helping link him to join a youth group, maybe a support group, financial assistance, mentoring. Maybe sport or other recreation. Yeah, definitely educational support, right? Especially because he did have to kind of drop out of high school to support his family, linking him to a support group, maybe with other recently arrived refugee youth. Educational programs besides ESL. Asking what his interests are and taking it from there. Yeah, so maybe we don't even know enough yet from this case example about kind of his goals and where he wants to go. So certainly kind of exploring with him first in terms of what he sees as his needs and goals. Thank you so much for that. So let's look at our second case example. This is Farzana. She's a 15-year-old girl who arrived in the US with her family after fleeing Afghanistan following the Taliban's return to power. After arriving in the United States, she struggled with feelings of loneliness and disconnection. One night, she had dinner with other newly arrived youth in her neighborhood and felt a sense of peace. Shortly after, Farzana began organizing weekend dinners for other newcomer youth in her community in hopes of providing them with the same sense of peace she felt. These gatherings provided a safe space for young people to share meals, talk about their journeys, and offer emotional support. And Farzana is now known in her neighborhood for regularly checking in on others, connecting youth with resources, and being the go-to person for community connection. So our first discussion question, similarly, what strengths and forms of resilience stand out to you in Farzana's story? Leadership, kind of unifying her community, creating a group, innovative for sure, taking initiative, empathy to support others, sense of community, creating a safe space. She's a go-getter for sure. She stood up to help new arrivals. She's organizing, she's using her experience to be there for others. She's resourceful. Absolutely. Adaptation and empathy. What I really like about this example is kind of her taking that initiative and leadership role in the community, kind of challenges some of the common narratives we might see about refugee and migrant youth being more passive recipients of support, right? Like she's going for it and finding, resources, supports that work for her and others, as opposed to kind of waiting on or relying on someone else to figure that out for her. Allison, go ahead and put the second discussion in the chat. So You know, a lot of you recognize her initiative and leadership. In what ways could providers at schools, resettlement agencies, or other programs work to uplift youth like Farzana in different types of leadership roles? What ideas do you have? Again, kind of thinking of building off of this strength that she's showing. What might leadership roles kind of look like within your programs or agencies? Maybe helping find spaces for them to gather, creating safe spaces, a group of refugee youth where maybe she takes on some sort of leadership role, even just recognition and praise for her accomplishments, conversation clubs or groups that allow youth to have a place to talk. Yeah, I could see Farzana being really good at helping kind of put something like that together. Meal sponsors, a family cookbook. Yeah, leading initiatives like that. Using her story. Oh, nice. As training for new staff. Yeah, kind of helping incorporate that direct experience that she's had so that new providers can kind of learn from that. Great. Okay, we're going to do one more example, which is Kweli. Kweli is originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo. He's a 12-year-old boy who arrived in the United States after spending 4 years in a refugee camp in Angola. He's one of 7 children, with some siblings remaining abroad and others resettled in the US with him and their mother. Recently arrived in a new country, Kweli focused his energy on learning English by watching YouTube videos and reading. Despite his success at adapting to school, he continues experiencing ongoing grief from the separation from his family and cultural adjustment. Rather than his grief having a paralyzing effect on him, it has ignited a sense of purpose for Kweli. So our first discussion question, in what ways do you see Kweli's story kind of reflecting strengths and resilience that might be overlooked in typical narratives of refugee and newcomer youth? A self-starter, for sure. Fast learner, strength in grief and loss, carrying on in the face of pain. Yeah, that's kind of like, that's kind of like what I think about when I think about the definition of resilience, right? Kind of carrying on despite all of that. Independence, proactive. What else? Yeah, some kind of stay withdrawn, but he really kind of trusted his potential. I like that. Took initiative, able to be hopeful, right? Hopeful for the future, future oriented. You learned English the same way. That's awesome, Amelia. Focuses on the positive, determination for sure. Yeah, one of the things that kind of sticks out to me in Kweli's example, and even kind of the compilation of these 3 examples, is that none of these 3 youth are allowing themselves to be defined solely by their trauma, right? And I feel like that's a really important message and reminder for us as providers, right? Not to define youth by their trauma or even to define them as refugee youth, but thinking of them as individual kids with their own interests, dreams, hope, goals, and capable of kind of setting their future course, which, we've seen in these 3 case examples, all 3 of those kids have been able to do. Allison, go ahead and put our last discussion question for Kweli. What strategies would you use with Kweli to help him explore his own strengths and goals? Any of the strategies we discussed today, how would you kind of explore Kweli's strengths and goals? Or any new strategies that you want to share with the group? How you would kind of approach that with this 12-year-old who's showing a lot of resilience, as you guys are noting in the chat, who's kind of taking control of his situation and focusing on the positive. What are some strategies you would use to help further explore his strengths and his goals? Yeah, definitely those I am, I have, I can activities would be good with him. Encouraging him to start his own YouTube channel. Nice. Reflecting his strength back, right, to where he is now. Yeah, sometimes when youth can't see it in themselves, right, all it takes is an adult to name it and kind of point it out to them. And that can be that can be huge for a youth and kind of developing their own sense of confidence and self-esteem. Connecting him with people in the community from his home country or cultural events. I saw that one. Great. Thank you guys so much for your participation. So, kind of throughout the training, we've talked a lot about strategies for more individual interventions for engaging with youth, activities to foster resilience. But hopefully, those case examples kind of also helped illustrate the importance of building a network of support to help youth in different aspects of their lives, right? So that includes, of course, social support. Sean talked early on about the importance of those strong family and caregiver relationships, also positive peer relationships and community supports and services. And as providers, we can really kind of help build the capacity of parents and caregivers, recognizing that refugee children are part of their environment. And that starts with their immediate environment, which is their family, right? By helping refugee parents and caregivers kind of meet their needs and develop their strengths, then we can have a lasting impact on the child who ultimately is under their care and receiving their support. And so things like supporting family bonding, coping, communication, conflict resolution, and again, kind of bridging that gap where needed is kind of an important role that we can have as providers. Also helping youth identify trusted adults, not just at home, but in other areas, as well as a positive peer network. And connecting them to trusted organizations and collaborating across disciplines. So none of us should be working in a silo with a refugee youth or family, right? But thinking about kind of how can we bring kind of a multidisciplinary team of providers together, whether that's the child's school, their resettlement case manager, mental health provider, legal, faith-based leader, et cetera, to really kind of create a network of care to support and bolster that youth. So our last discussion for today is to just take some time to think about, kind of reflect and think about some key takeaways. So we'd love to hear from you here. Go ahead and share in the chat one strategy or new piece of information that you're taking away from this training that you plan to implement to support a refugee youth or family that you're currently working with. What are some of your all's main takeaways? Listening more. I love it. Yes. What else? Focusing on strengths. Yeah, taking that strengths-based approach. I know you're not asking me for advice and it's your choice, but would you like to know my thoughts about that? Nice. I am, I can. The toolkit. Adapting the toolkit to parent sessions. That's great. Focusing on the client's needs specifically. Listening to the youth. Helping set goals. Youth being leaders within their community. Personal mission statement. More care for the youth's knowledge, attitude, and skills. Short-term goals mindset. Yep, absolutely. Letting them feel seen and important, believing they can adapt, become empowered, and thrived. Awesome. The setting and achievement of goals, starting small, right? Starting with those baby steps. Thank you guys so much. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the Q&A. While we're doing that, we really want to encourage you to please scan that QR code that you see on your screen. Allison's also going to put a direct link on the chat. We really rely on you to provide feedback about today's training so we can see what we did well, what we should do differently, and then kind of adapt and improve for future trainings. We still have some other comments coming in the chat. That's great. Yeah, continue to share those responses. I'm going to go ahead and look at the Q&A. And we do have at least one question here. This is a really great question. How to deal with autonomy and responsibility with young adults as they start to work, earn their own money, how to help parents with that. Yeah, so we kind of saw this in Jean Reynaud's example, right, where he took on a bit of that adult role. And in that case, it was because his mother was ill. In some ways, it felt like he kind of had that responsibility or didn't have much of a choice. But I do think, this is an example of where, kind of facilitating conversations and communication between youth and their parents and caregivers just to set really clear expectations, right? So, okay, the youth is deciding to work because they want to earn their own money. Okay, what are kind of the parameters around that? What are the expectations? Are they dropping out of school? Are they continuing with school? Are there specific hours they can work? Have we talked about kind of workers' rights and what a safe work environment looks like and made sure that it's a safe work environment? I think, I think the reality is that um, uh, again, sometimes there's just a financial necessity for, refugee or newcomer youth to work to support their families, whether here in the US or families back home. And so, if that's something that the youth is doing willingly, right, that's obviously different from them being forced to do that. But I think those are kind of, assessment questions that we can have in mind as we're exploring with the youth their reasons for working, what they do with their money, and things like that. And then also kind of exploring with the youth and caregiver together what the expectations are regarding, yeah, working hours and how the youth spends their time attending school, what they do with their money and things like that. But that's a really great question. Sean, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that one.
No, I think you pretty much covered it there. So yeah, that was a great response.
So again, kind of as we're waiting for questions to come in, really ask that you please go ahead and scan that QR code to complete the training evaluation. Allison, if you don't mind just putting that link in the chat one more time so it's fresh on people's chat screen. I wanted to just let you know that within the slides, we also have a lot of really, really helpful resources from Switchboard, BRICS, UNICEF. Sean was referring to the International Resilience Project with the I Am, I Have, I Can. There's a lot of great resources and information there. So really encourage you to check that out. And then ask that you save the date. So our next monthly webinar will be scheduled for October 29th from 2 to 3:30 Eastern. It will be related to addressing mental health of refugee children and youth, practical strategies for trauma-informed and culturally responsive support. And if you have any questions, you can contact us at refugeeyouth.rc@refugees.org. And we'll be sending out some more information about the upcoming webinar in October. I'll also be sending kind of a follow-up email to anyone who attended today with all of the important links that we shared. I can see some of you guys are saying the evaluation link is not working for you, but for some it is. So I'll send it out via email and then we can maybe help troubleshoot. I'm not sure why that would be working for some and not others. Thank you so much for attending, and we so appreciate the work that you're doing and the support that you're providing to refugee children and families, and we hope to see you next month. Take care,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody.
Thank you.